Hello again, this is Dr. Michael Bogart welcoming you back to our video series Exploring World Religions. In session 15 we're looking at Protestantism, and in clip 1 we looked at the historical setting which brought on the protest. In this clip we'll look at Lutheranism and the Anabaptists, two very different approaches to getting back to the Christianity of the New Testament, which is what Protestants were all about. Okay, let's start with Lutheranism. According to the popular story, on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Saxony, now Germany. From that moment on, the Protestant Reformation was a thing. But who was this obscure German churchman, this Martin Luther? Well, he was born in Eisleben in 1483, in the eastern part of what is now Germany. Then it was the Duchy of Saxony within the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther was a bright young man whose parents were of some prominence in the area. These parents were determined that Martin Luther should become a lawyer, so off he went to the university to study law. But he soon lost interest in law in favor of philosophy. Now, on his way home during a break from classes, Martin was caught out in the open during a terrible thunderstorm, and in his terror, he appealed to St. Anne to save his life, and he vowed to become a monk if she would save him. So, his life being spared, he entered the Augustinian order of monks in 1505. Now, Luther was a serious-minded person, and as a monk, he took a no-nonsense approach to the monastic life, things like confession and penance, for example. As time went on, he began to struggle with a sense of his own sin and deep feelings of unworthiness, far beyond what was considered acceptable for monks. Luther's superior, Johann von Staupitz, was alarmed that Luther was sinking into a very dark place in his life, especially when Luther privately told him that he hated God and Jesus, because he was desperately afraid that God was going to be sending him to hell. So to get his mind off these dark thoughts, von Staupitz sent him away to earn his doctorate. And once he had achieved that goal, he was actually ordained as a priest and assigned to teach the New Testament book of Romans at the brand new University of Wittenberg. It was while teaching the book of Romans that Luther came to his pivotal realization that God's gracious provision of forgiveness and salvation can be appropriated not by living some kind of exemplary life, but by simply trusting in Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross. This grace from God is received, Luther said, through faith alone, without some list of good works that many Catholic leaders of his time were insisting on. Romans 1:17 was the Bible verse that triggered this insight. It says, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Now, this private realization turned into a public issue when Grand Commissioner John Tetzel made his tour of Germany selling papal indulgences. Now, what were indulgences? Indulgences were essentially a legal document granting amnesty for all or part of the penalty for particular sins and a reduction of time that a person would have to spend in purgatory. The theory centered around something called the treasury of merit, which supposedly was a pool of righteousness accumulated by the saints. Well, this surplus righteousness could be accessed by the church and granted to those who either made contributions to the church or who offered certain services. Tetzel's marketing slogan was, "When the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." Now, Pope Leo X was using these indulgences to finance the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And Martin Luther strongly denounced these indulgences, asking how the church could claim to sell what Christ gave freely. Luther wrote many books and pamphlets in this and other abuses of what he saw, which were widely circulated across the German-speaking regions of Europe, and for this he was summoned to account for his criticisms at the Diet, or Council, of Worms in 1521. And Luther came prepared to defend his criticisms, but instead when he got there he was told there was to be no debate, but instead he must renounce all of his writings. In his statement, Luther refused to renounce them, affirming that the Bible is the supreme authority over the church. It's not popes, not councils. And he ended with the now famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me." For this, Luther was excommunicated and put under a death sentence. But he was shielded from execution by his sympathetic patron, Duke Frederick of Saxony, who hid him in the Wartburg Castle for well over a year. And during this time of hiding, Luther translated the New Testament and eventually the entire Bible into German, which was widely published thanks to the fairly new technology of Gutenberg's printing press. Seeing that his attempts to reform the Catholic Church had failed, Luther rallied churchmen and nobles who were fed up with the church for various reasons and formed the Lutheran Church. Luther was the founder and visionary, but the organization of the movement fell to his protege, Philip Melanchthon. Needing leaders for the new churches, he recruited former priests and monks. He retrained them and placed them in parishes. Now, Luther saw no place in the Bible that forbids marriage for church leaders, so he organized the first dating service, so to speak, the first eHarmony.com, where he could match former priests and monks with former nuns to establish godly pastoral families to lead their congregations. Now, Luther did not feel inclined to tamper with the civil government, so he tended to allow rulers to govern as they saw fit, with only occasional advice from the church. And a dark stain on this time was the Peasants' Revolt and its brutal suppression by the German princes. Actually, Luther urged them to put it down. Eventually, Lutheranism replaced Catholicism in the northern German regions, in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and some other Baltic countries. There were wars with Catholic rulers, but peace was achieved eventually, and Lutheranism became legal in 1555 at the Peace of Augsburg. So what are Lutheran distinctives? Well, they are faith in Christ alone for salvation, the Bible as the ultimate source of authority, and married clergy. Lutherans retained 2 of the 7 sacraments, baptism and Holy Communion. Let's move on to the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were the main surviving group of a larger movement known as the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation included a spectrum of groups which sought to break with Roman Catholicism much more decisively than Luther had done. This break involved removing centuries of accumulated traditions in the Catholic Church and the formation of new church groups based solely on the New Testament. Now, this more austere breakaway from Catholicism began in Zurich, Switzerland, with a group led by the priest Ulrich Zwingli. At about the same time that Martin Luther had become vocal about church abuses in Germany, Zwingli began to be concerned about similar issues in Switzerland. As Luther's stand became more public, Zwingli became vocal as well and was able to persuade many in the Swiss districts to leave the Catholic Church and form a new Swiss Protestantism. There were even efforts to join with the fledgling Lutheran movement in Germany, with which they had much in common. And the union ultimately failed, however, but mainly over a single point of doctrine, the nature of Holy Communion. Luther maintained that the bread and wine were changed in essence, though not in material substance, into the body and blood of Christ. But Zwingli believed that the elements were simply symbolic of Christ's body and blood. There were other breaks in Swiss Protestantism, a main one led by one of Zwingli's young protégés, Conrad Grebel. Grebel and his associates felt that Zwingli, and Luther for that matter, had not gone nearly far enough in breaking from Catholicism. The real sticking point was the issue of infant baptism. Grebel and the young radicals insisted that only those who could reasonably demonstrate personal conversion to Christ should be baptized, so no infants. Hence the name Anabaptist. Anabaptist simply means rebaptizing people who were baptized as infants before in the Catholic Church. But the term has now come to mean those who accept only those who could testify of their personal conversion to Christ. The young radicals experienced rejection in Switzerland, and they corresponded with other radical groups springing up all over Europe like Andreas Karlstadt and Thomas Munster, who had both broken with Luther in the early 1520s. Grebel's more radical writings influenced other Anabaptist groups throughout Europe who had broken from the Catholic Church. A quick background begins with an early admirer of Luther, Melchior Hoffman. He quickly became disillusioned with the Lutheran movement because they rejected his visions and prophecies about the imminent coming of Jesus. Hoffman toured North Germany and the Netherlands, but eventually was driven out of those regions and fled to the city of Münster in central Germany. The city of Munster embraced Hoffman's teachings, including his commitment to the Anabaptist doctrine of baptism of believers only. So the Munsterites drove out or executed all those who were opposed to their ideas and set up an independent political entity in rebellion against the Catholic Church and the entire Holy Roman Empire. Leadership in Munster eventually passed from Hoffman to an associate named Jan van Leyden. Leyden went much further than Hoffman by claiming supreme authority for himself as a representative of God and mandating community property and even polygamy. The movement now known as the Munster Rebellion was put down in 1535 by Catholic troops after a lengthy siege. Now there was a Dutch priest named Menno Siemens who had converted to the Anabaptist views and had been observing this catastrophe from his home base in the Netherlands. Siemens had strongly denounced the violence and non-biblical excesses of Van Leyden and the Munster Anabaptists. Under his leadership, scattered groups of Anabaptists in the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland were stabilized and organized. Siemens taught monogamy, pacifism, and simple Christian living. But the Anabaptists faced many problems, including the fact that they were disliked practically everywhere they were found. So they suffered persecution, and many settled eventually in Russia, where they were invited by Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, while others migrated to the New World when the opportunity arose, settling in the more inclusive colony of Pennsylvania. Today they are known as the followers of Menno or Mennonites, of which the Amish are the most traditional branch. And by the way, the Mennonites had a great influence on a group of dissenters within the Church of England who had separated from that church over the issue of believers' baptism, and they're now called Baptists. But Baptists are not classified as Anabaptists. Anabaptist distinctives include emphasis on teaching the New Testament, a personal conversion experience, the baptism of believers only, pacifism, and simple, plain living. Okay, so much for clip 2 and video session 15 within the Exploring World Religions series. I hope this quick look at Lutheranism and the Anabaptists has been helpful. In clip 3, we will continue on to 2 more Protestant groups, the Reformed churches and Anglicanism, and of course all the offshoots of Anglicanism. Till then, this is Dr. Michael Bogart. We'll see you next time.